So thanks everybody for being here. Appreciate it very much. Excited to have this kickoff 2025 with this Institute of Applied Meta Theory showcase of one of our very cool initiatives that when we first heard about it, I just knew that we wanted to do something along these lines. So I thought I would tee up a little bit about why we got excited about it to begin with. It's the Cultural Complexity Index and its leader, Graham Dempsey, for those of you who I think everybody has met, but if not, then you'll certainly meet him very, very soon and hear all about the initiative. And of course, we're also recording this to send out to the broader integral and integrative communities. So just to set some brief context for IAM's support of the CCI, as we all know, because we're in these communities, the evolution of the notion of the evolution of human society goes back a long way, right? We go back to theorists like Herbert Spencer, Karl Marx, Toynbee, Robert Bellah, Habermas, some of whom I think Brendan will at least touch on a little bit. This concept that human society evolves, and it can evolve in stages. And of course, this is something that we talk a lot about and we learn a lot about inside of integrative communities, the notion that society evolves, it becomes more complex and it becomes more conscious over time. And of course, we also have stage models that correlate psychological development with social development, with societal development. The notion that ontogeny, the psychological developmental process, is recapitulated under recapitulation theory, recapitulated with phylogenetic development or social evolutionary development. So these two things are somehow, correlated. And of course, this is a big and exciting claim. It goes back to people like Ernst Haeckel and Lev Vygotsky and, of course, Ken Wilber himself. And it's this really, really rich territory. Over the last century, of course, the science on the psychometric side has gotten increasingly robust. So that's the psychological piece that's exciting. And of course, the understanding of social evolution has also really grown as sociologists and others have looked at how societies get more and more complex over time. But correlating that bridge between the two is always fairly speculative. I mean, it made sense, and different theorists looked at it in slightly different ways, but it was also a bit of a speculative thing. So for years, and this is a true story, for years, as I would read this various literature, I always asked myself, gosh, what would it look like to take a really rigorous approach to trying to actually validate that bridge, to trying to validate the notion that what we're seeing in the complexification in one kind of scientific area can help us to understand what might actually be happening in terms of society. And that's really what the notion of a cultural complexity index does. And so when this project came forward to us, it was like an instant match for something that really needed to be done, super important work. And Brendan was very clearly the kind of leader we wanted to back to do it. Very scholarly, passionate about the material, had all the right background for it, had a real social entrepreneurial energy about him. And so we were just thrilled to get behind that. And it's really been a great project in really the 7 months that we've been working on, although it feels like a lot longer because there's been so much progress in it. So in a moment, I'll turn it over to Brendan to provide a sort of overview of all of the efforts that he's gone through and that the team has gone through, as it really is a team effort. And then that'll take, I don't know, maybe a half hour to 45 minutes, however long it takes. And then we'll go into a discussion and Q&A with all of us. And I think that's it. That's the format. So we'll block out till about 1:30, but we can really go as long as we want. I thought I would start just to kick us off, because I think it's in the spirit of this, just to give you a sense of how rich, how thematic this work is. I thought I would start with a quote from Habermas himself, from one of his great works where he actually gets into this, Communication and the Evolution of Society. And you'll see so many of the themes that you're about to hear about with the Cultural Complexity Index that come out of this quote. And forgive the geekiness. I mean, he is a German philosopher after all. So he says social systems, by drawing on the learning capacity of social subjects, individuals, can form new structures in order to solve steering problems that threaten their continued existence. Basically, societies can learn because it helps them to overcome problems. To this extent, the evolutionary learning process of societies is dependent on the competences of the individuals that belong to them. The latter, in turn, acquire their competences not as isolated monads, but by growing into the symbolic structures of their life worlds, by their language systems, their symbolic structures, language systems, which is something that cultural complexity really centers inside of its method. And he goes on in a different chapter, but related. Let us assume for a moment that developmental patterns for the normative structures of a certain society could be reconstructed and corroborated. This is what the Cultural Complexity Index is kind of doing. Such rationally reconstructible patterns then represent rules for possible problem solving. The learning mechanisms have to be sought first on the psychological level. If that succeeds, with the help of cognitive developmental psychology, there is need for additional empirical assumptions that might explain sociologically how individual learning processes find their way into a society's collectively accessible store of knowledge. It is a perfect tee up for you, Brendan, as you kick off what you're about to show with the Cultural Complexity Index. And with that, I will spotlight you and have you take us away.
Awesome. Well, gosh, thanks. That was an excellent introduction and a wonderful setup to this. And I first off just want to say thank you so much to you, Rob. Thanks to IAM, the whole community, for seeing the importance of a project like this. And again, that quote is great, and all the figures that you named are great for setting up the historical context for a project like this, which has been kind of kicking around speculatively for, centuries even. And as you noted, this is sort of an opportunity to rigorously, empirically put it to the test and try to validate it. So, yes, well, without further ado, I'm going to launch into this and discuss the Cultural Complexity Index. And as Rob said, we've been at this now for just about 7 months and already have some really fascinating findings I'm looking forward to sharing. So without further ado, let's dive in. So I'm just going to bring this up into a couple of sections. One is, what is the CCI? Then we're going to get into the results to date, and then we can, as Rob said, get into some discussion and Q&A. So launching us off, what is a Cultural Complexity Index? Well, in addition to everything wonderful that Rob just set us up with, I think it's helpful to try to contextualize this within a broader, framework, which is complexifying cosmos. And to do this, I'll draw on a couple of meta-theoretical models that can help with this. This image in particular comes from the UTOK model, the Unified Theory of Knowledge, which does a great job, I think, in sort of laying out the map of cosmic complexification. Here you can see the specific kind of emergent planes of complexity that have emerged over the past 14 billion years. I think another thing that's helpful about this model is it helps us to understand what these emergent planes are by noting that they arise out of emergent novel information processing systems. So from matter to life to mind to culture, you get out of matter, you get life, which is processing genetic information. Out of life, you get mind, which is processing neuronal information. And out of minded animals, out of mind, you get culture, which is processing symbolic information. And we can be kind of clearer about this and more colloquial and just say, express it in these terms, that with life, we're talking about DNA. That's what genetic information, that's sort of the language of genetic information. With mind, neurons are that neuronal complexity, that information processing system. And with culture, it's words, it's language, it's symbolic information communication. And that these are basically the media through which this complexification process is unfolding at a cosmic scale across these different levels, mind, matter, life, mind, and culture. Now, when we're talking about information processing, this is a nice kind of setup to discuss not only what that means, but why it's significant. And here this takes us to the notion of meaningful information. It's not just any kind of information that we're particularly concerned with. It's specifically that information which learning entities are able to process in contexts for their continued viability. And so one way of thinking about this is that we've got, as again, learning entities in contexts that are processing various kinds of information for you could say negentropy or negative entropy. This is what allows entities that are informationally rich to resist entropic dissolution in an entropic universe. Also, adaptability. Entities need to learn in order to adapt, in order to become more environmentally fit and sort of matched to their particular niches. Error correction, basically building better world models, being able to more successfully predict one's environment, again, for the sake of, and actually for all of these are for the sake of increased viability and flourishing. So this is really what we're talking about for the processing of meaningful information. And this is kind of the kind of idea that I'll be using for meaning going forward in this presentation, because ultimately we are looking in the CCI at meaning and the complexification and the evolution of meaning through cultural evolution. So when we go back to this map and we situate this process in this cosmic sort of complexifying scheme, we also note that we have different contexts for these for this learning to unfold. So organisms are learning in ecologies, which are collectives of organisms, and animals are learning in environments, persons in societies. These are sort of the individual and the collective contexts in which these processes are unfolding, learning entities and their environments. And again, processing specific kinds of information as they do for meaning. So I think maybe this is probably somewhat more familiar presentation of the same idea, using here a different meta-theoretical model. This is the integral model. And here you've got the same levels, matter, life, mind, and culture, but they're presented more like a mandala structure where you can see very clearly, how they're building off of each other and transcending and including what came before. And in this context, of course, you've got the individual on top, the collective on bottom, which here you could say is essentially the learning entity and the collective context for learning in the bottom quadrants. And this is the sort of what John Vervaeke would call the transjective context for meaning to unfold, for the individual in their environments to be processing these different kinds of information for meaning. And as this is unfolding, again, meaning is because of the complexification of the environment and because of the complexification of the individual organisms, the learning entities, meaning itself is actually complexifying. It's growing, it's expanding. I could say more about this if you're interested in what this can kind of look like, but that's kind of the overall vision here of this different sets of processing of different kinds of information across cosmic evolution. So this is happening again across matter, life, mind, and culture. We are going to focus on the culture plane. And at this level, when we just kind of zoom in on this element of this cosmic process, we're really essentially talking about sort of individual psychology, the mind of the individual learning entity, and the collective social, cultural context, which you could refer to as the sociological sphere. But again, because we're talking about learning specifically, maybe a better way of expressing this would be to talk about developmental psychology and the sociologies of knowledge, because developmental psychologies they provide us the models of the learning human mind. And with sociologies of knowledge, you're talking about how societies build up and creative knowledge stores and how they pass along information, how knowledge gets institutionalized, et cetera. So again, drawing on these integral maps to be able to appreciate individual and collective levels of this process, which are deeply intertwined. So for the developmental psychology angle, we've had wonderful maps to draw from the cognitive developmental tradition. And here, for most of the 20th century, the go-to has been the Piagetian models, which Piaget, of course, the great cognitive developmental psychologist and genetic epistemologist, he proposed through a series, of many decades of empirical study, essentially a kind of four-stage model for cognitive development: sensory, motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational stages. And again, this has been sort of a go-to model for most of the 20th century, and it provides a really wonderful overview of how the mind grows, develops, and how different stages of the learning process change over time. Now, when you go to apply this kind of a model to this sort of approach, you get a familiar move, at least a move that many in this audience will be familiar with, which when you look at cognitive developmental psychology and you try to pair that, as Rob suggested in the beginning setup here, with a kind of cultural collective worldview system or meaning system, then you can see a correlation between, it's been proposed, a pre-operational stage and a so-called magical worldview, concrete operations correlated with a sort of mythic worldview, formal operations leading to a kind of rational worldview, and post-formal thought leading to a kind of integral or integrative worldview. And some version of this has been, a theory proposed by many, many scholars. Again, Rob named a number of them at the outset, including the Habermas one there. But of course, obviously Wilbur as well, and many others. And this has been an incredibly valuable and powerful way of being able to integrate these different levels of analysis and to understand cultural evolution through this kind of lens. So that's all well and good, you could say. At the same time, the Piagetian model is, at this point, a little dated. Some of these models that were kind of the go-tos in the 20th century have gotten a little long in the tooth. And Piaget passed away in 1980, but already in the 70s, you had people critiquing some of these models, drawing out certain flaws or limitations of them. And this basically set off a movement beginning around that time and lasting into the early 2010s called the Neo-Piagetian move in the kind of cognitive developmental sciences, which tried to basically update and revise the Piagetian models to kind of bring them up to date, into line with the most cutting edge theory and evidence. And so as Piaget's models sort of got analyzed and improved in this way, you saw the emergence in starting in around 1980, the emergence of these models of hierarchical complexity, which for a time became the kind of leading edge in this field of study. So here, just to pause for a second, you can see how already you're looking at those 4 and 5, if you count the post-formal stages of Piaget's model, really broken down into a much greater level of refinement, granularity. For each one of those stages, it's now 2 or even 3 stages or substages. So what happened in this period of neo-Piagetian development of the theory was that these models got incredibly refined, and we could do a lot more kind of precision work with them. And so from 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, this was really kind of the leading edge. Well, today, I would argue this process has continued, and now the leading edge is really found in the Lectical Scale, which has continued that sort of neo-Piagetian line of work, but has really taken it just to a whole new level of granularity and refinement. If you compare, for example, here, the stages 7 through 13, in the Lectical Scale, this is broken down now into like a 100-point scale per each of those levels. So you just get an incredible level of granularity, and an ability to really zoom in with profound, precision, I guess you could say. So one way of thinking about it is like Piaget and his early models gives us, in a sense, sort of a yardstick for cognitive developmental study. The Neo-Piagetian models of hierarchical complexity give us something like feet, and with the Lectical Scale, you're able to get something like millimeters, essentially. So really taking that refinement to a whole new level, updating the methodologies, updating the empirical basis for all of this, and really just presenting a whole new way of doing this kind of analysis. Now, the way it is able to do this is not only novel, but it's what allows for that level of precision. So specifically, Lectica and the Lectical Scale, which is Theo Dawson's model, looks at lexical analysis to determine hierarchical complexity, which is basically, it's looking at the words that are being used. It's looking at the actual language in texts and being able to find meaningful correlations between the ideas expressed in that language and hierarchical complexity. So this is just like a chart, for example, where an empirically derived one, actually, that shows how different ideas will unfold through hierarchical complexification, and that these can be mapped in terms of language use. Now, this is important, again, if you'll remember that we're talking about culture, which is predicated on the processing of symbolic information or words, language. And so if this is suggestive of the idea that there's something like a complexity axis in language itself, then we really have in the lectical scale a really precise measurement tool to look at the complexification of symbolic information. And essentially, the precision then comes when you're able to look at the distributions across a performance of these different ideas in a text as they're mapped to different levels of complexity. So you get a vision of something like this, which again is I think they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is such a fascinating thing to me, where what you're really looking at here is kind of the distribution of different levels of hierarchical complexity as they're mapped to the different lectical levels. I put the numbers down there, and I also put their terms in the MHC for those who are more familiar with that. But just to use an example, if you look at levels 10 and 11, if you compare, say, 10A and 11C or 11D, all of that before in Piaget's model would have just been called essentially formal operations. But with a map like this, you're able to get really fine-grained detail analysis. And not only that, I think something like this is really a powerful image to show that kind of sedimentation of knowledge, of ideas as they build on themselves. So, you can actually see kind of the transcending and including of earlier knowledge forms in hierarchical complexification through this kind of analysis when you apply the lectical scale to language use. Okay. So what does all that mean for the CCI? What is the CCI relative to these kinds of models? Well, one way of thinking about that is that we're basically looking at this relationship that we talked about. We're interested in exploring this relationship, but at this level of granularity. Another way to think about it is we're looking at the complexification of the culture plane through its processing of symbolic information, but we're actually looking to, in a sense, measure that process of complexification using the lectical scale by examining cultural evolution, cultural complexification through that sort of analysis. Of course, again, we're not just talking about any old kind of information, though. We're talking about meaningful information, and meaning complexifies. So what we're really thinking about then here with this process is actually the complexification of meaning in culture. So one way then to get into that question, to analyze that question rigorously and to apply these methods would be to ask, well, what are the meanings that we see in the great texts, in the great written literature of culture, in the axial age religions, for example, in the Bible, in the Quran, in the Rig Veda? What about on into the modern period? And you're looking at Spinoza, Descartes, Newton, Darwin. What about postmodern theory and deconstructive analysis? What does it look like if you take these kinds of texts and you submit them for hierarchical analysis, hierarchical complexity analysis using the lectical scale? What does this tell us? What sort of picture does it reveal? What sort of trends might we be able to see in the development of these different meaning systems through time? Well, that is essentially what the Cultural Complexity Index is endeavoring to do. And as, again, Rob said, it's a team effort here. I'm working with Henry Kurtz and as well Theo Dawson herself, who's doing the hierarchical complexity analysis for these texts using advanced computer software as well as sort of manual analysis. And the process is basically compiling a vast database of the world's literature of meaningful information, you could say, and subjecting it to this kind of analysis. Now, to do this, we're organizing these texts into kind of particular bins, which will be familiar probably to this audience from, integral and other models. We're also drawing on the work of Robert Bellah and his ideas around the evolution of religion. But the basic idea here is, yeah, let's examine what stories are revealed by a complexification analysis of the meaning systems of the world as we find them in the historical record through cultural evolution. And what does that empirical analysis say? Does it validate the kinds of theories that Rob was talking about at the outset, or does it challenge them? Do we find in this kind of analysis some kind of, final, in a sense, sort of data that can again sort of support or problematize some of the models that we've been using? And for the first time, this project is sort of exploring that issue and very rigorously testing those models. So I could talk now about what the results are, but I can also pause here in case, Rob, you want to ask any questions, or we could say anything else at this stage before diving into those.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think that why don't we just continue on? I have a series
Okay.
of questions that I'll tee up at the end, but I think that it's great. Just continue on.
Okay, great. So in onto the results then. So yes, okay. At this point, we're only 7 months in. It's taken us some time to get this whole thing set up, and we've got some initial data that we're going to share. At this point, we've got around 50% of our forager corpus in, which is around 15 assessments of stories from hunter-gatherer societies. We've also got around over 100 assessments in from our archaic corpus, and are expecting around 50 more, looking at biblical materials and Epic of Gilgamesh and various polytheistic societal texts, this sort of thing. So even this information is still coming in, but I think we can already use what we already have to begin to tell some of this story, which is really exciting to me. So I'll use what data we have to start in a very preliminary way, just to kind of suggest what the data is suggesting and what we can make of it to tell the story of cultural complexification. So I'll use this little grid here to get at this. On the y-axis, you've got the Lectical Scale here, and for those more familiar with the MHC, there's that. And at the on the x-axis, you have the number of assessments done so far on these particular texts. So we begin with our forager corpus, where we've got 15 assessments. These are of oral stories told in hunter-gatherer societies that have been kind of very carefully selected. And I could get into the methodology if you're interested to get into that. And when we look at these stories and we look at the meanings in them, we do find the content-wise very representative of animistic societies. There's shamanic content, talk of spirits, very fascinating materials in terms of the meaning structures involved here. But one thing that this corpus allows us to, in some ways, do is be a kind of placeholder for what we can think of as what Paleolithic or Neolithic societies and the meaning structures potentially prevalent in those hunter-gatherer societies might have been. So at this level, we're talking about, again, we got pre-agricultural, animistic, hunter-gatherer society meaning structures. And if you tell that through the kind of evolutionary context, and then you situate that on into the rise of agriculture around 10,000 BC, which eventually also occasions the rise of literacy, and which then itself, which occurs around 3,500 BC, which then gets devoted to telling meaningful stories and used to produce literature and epics and that sort of thing in ancient Near Eastern societies, for example, in ancient Mesopotamia. By that time, or let's say around 1300, you get the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we scored that text, and there you've got a meaning structure in a kind of polytheistic society, agriculture, as I mentioned, but also a very fascinating tale for those who've read it, dealing with death and the meaning of life and these sorts of things in that context. About 100 years later, we also find the Baal cycle, which is another polytheistic text from a culture in the ancient Levant, ancient Canaan, basically, and a similar set of ideas, but also a similar social milieu, similar kind of social complexity, and a kind of scribal apparatus attached to a temple complex, this sort of thing. And so it's interesting. Now, again, telling this historically, when you look at what happens around 1177, you get what's called the Bronze Age collapse, where a lot of that social complexity falls apart, disappears. And in the wake of that, that's where you see the emergence of ancient Israel and the early biblical materials, which, when we scored those, landed in this zone. This is the early Yahwist and Elohist strands of the Torah, which, if you read them, are kind of a mixture between kind of tribal, pastoral society. It is polytheistic in context, but also gesturing in a new kind of direction, and appears again in this sort of Dark Age after the Bronze Age collapse. Now, as that Bronze Age collapse, as people start coming back from that, ancient Israel develops a very elaborate scribal bureaucracy, temple and palace complex, etc. And actually, eventually around 600 is comparable in kind of that level of social complexity to other ancient Near Eastern kingdoms from the past. And when we scored texts that were written from this period, which are called the priestly and Deuteronomy sources, it was interesting because they matched the kinds of scores that we found in the Baal cycle and the Epic of Gilgamesh. So we see, again, a fascinating correlation between social complexity levels and hierarchical complexity levels, a matching between the kind of systemic structures and educational structures of a society and the kind of meaning structures that are being developed in this society. So this is where we're at the moment, and this is also the basis of the first paper that this project will be submitting to sort of the broader academic conversation, using these novel levels of analysis, these novel approaches. And just yesterday, actually, Henriques, he finished the statistical analysis on our project, and this is a lovely little graphic of those different biblical strata that we can actually now associate with levels of hierarchical complexity difference that map to different socio-complexity differences and are statistically significant. So he did great work with that, and I'm really excited to submit this for publication. So that's basically, as I said, where this project is at the moment. We're early on in this, but already I think we're getting some fascinating results that broadly are, I would argue, validating, but also updating some of these models that we've been using around cultural evolution. So when we, for example, try to tie these to, well, even just looking at them from the fact of the corpus that they're situated in, and tie them to the models that have historically been used to understand these different meaning structures, we see that the forager corpus kind of clusters around a score of 900. We see that the archaic corpus tends to cluster somewhere around 1,000. And this is then the question of what comes next. Well, in our study, what will come next is the axial age. It's the axial texts. It is, those later biblical materials and on into Plato and the Bhagavad Gita, etc. So where will those land? Here, I mean, this is my hypothesis. I think that this is very likely, and I think that this is a very, makes a lot of sense that we'd see something like this. On into the modern, where will those texts score? Similarly, postmodern, and of course, integral or integrative texts, where do those score? These are kind of suggestions, but I think that we're starting to maybe see this picture emerge, and that to me is incredibly exciting. But at this moment, the story is to be continued until we get more data to validate those claims and hypotheses. So I'll wrap this up. I'll just touch on some major contributions and implications of this. Hopefully you're as excited as I am by all of this. I think that this kind of data is fascinating, but it also, it stands to contribute so much to various fields of study. I'll talk a little bit about the prehistoric anthropology in a second, but also early civilizations research, the way that this relates to the difference between oral culture and storytelling and literacy and the development of literature and the way that this affects thought. fascinating implications for this kind of analysis. Again, the axial age debate, which has long been raging, often theorized as a sort of cognitive, in cognitive terms, as a sort of development there, but never demonstrated necessarily in that sense definitively. Well, we might get the first definitive kinds of data that could be used to inform that debate. Same with early modern studies, and I'll also mention, of course, postmodern studies and theory. Notions around, is integrative thought actually more complex than postmodern thought, which is a claim that's often made. Can we move that idea from just theory or speculation to actually empirically validating that idea? And then the bigger kind of contributions or implications here, as I've been saying, this is really the first empirical basis for the validation of these models. It can inform new approaches to sociolinguistics, looking at texts and trying to link them to contexts. The biblical paper, for example, is applying this to source criticism and trying to show how the thinking structures can actually be tied to specific sources that have gone into the composition of texts. We can also do some fascinating work along the reconstruction of learning pathways in issues of meaning throughout human culture. I showed you that table, for example, that looked at the word truth and how that evolves as it undergoes complexification. What if you did that with a word like God or spirit, these sorts of things, right? You could start to do some fascinating studies in analytical studies, rational reconstruction studies of how issues of meaning and ultimate concern have complexified through cultural evolution. And then finally, these also suggest updates to our existing meta-theoretical models. This is, of course, a very famous picture from the integral model, which looks at the different altitudes, and specifically in this picture ties them to those different cognitive developmental levels. But if you look and you see the correlations here, these, in light of our data, might need to be seriously rethought when you actually see what the texts are revealing in terms of their hierarchical complexity scores. So specifically, we're seeing early formal here, between red and amber, we're seeing advanced concrete operations at the magenta level, which is to say at the tribal forager level. And this is a kind of rethinking of the cognitive levels at these particular cultural stages and altitudes that I think could be meaningful on a number of fronts. I think it could help revitalize some of the thinking on this that, for example, has been problematic around the infantilization of indigenous societies by linking that to a pre-operational stage, which is problematic. Our data is showing that it actually everything in a sense has to be moved down in terms, or you could say moved up, depending on what way you think about it, the cognitive complexity linked to these different kinds of cultural meaning systems. So that's exciting stuff to see these models getting updated, getting revised, and seeing that coming out of testing the data and revising the speculative hypotheses. So more to come on that. That's basically it for my presentation, and I welcome any sort of discussion and questions, but thank you all so much.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Brendan. Thank you. Thank you very much. Obviously, fire hose of an overview, but I think that's really great. We'll open it up here just in a moment for a wide-ranging conversation and dive right into it. I suppose, obviously there's a lot there, and a lot of moving pieces that we can get into, but let's start with the last piece and kind of work backwards. For a lot of people, I think that'll be a really cool punchline in terms of the takeaway. It's like, okay, we've had these models. Obviously, all models are subject to a little bit of a update or falsification and finer granularity. And in a way, that's what we're finding with this is, okay, our models, our ruler is a little bit off. Like we need to correlate the ruler a little bit differently based on the actual data that's coming in. So how do you think about that as you've seen that?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a really important thing. I guess the way I would think about it is, in some ways, these models that we have now, like the lectical scale, are you can correlate them, you can show the way that they're related to the earlier Piagetian models, but there are also ways in which they're different. So it's not just that there's greater granularity; it's also that over the 40 years since those earlier models, there's been rethinking of some of the deeper theory as well. And so you get an interesting and kind of difficult situation where it's not just as simple as saying, oh, well, this is more or less the same thing, but it's just more specific. In some ways, like what lectical level 9, for example, is not quite the same as concrete operations per se, but it is related to it. So I think we have to kind of grapple with updating kind of the presuppositions that we're bringing to this material, updating just our priors and our kind of prejudices with the kinds of things that we've already encountered by studying this material so deeply. We might already have a kind of implicit, or what's the term for it, a kind of almost intuitive feeling for these different altitudes and how they relate to these different maybe cognitive levels that is hard to actually like put that aside to just work with the existing data that we're getting using the specific models that we're using. So anyway, there's a kind of learning that we have to do to, I think, kind of be open to that and update it. But I'm also excited about it because I think on the one hand, it helps resolve some problems that I think if you've questioned certain things about these models in the past, you're like, well, wait a second, that doesn't quite make sense, or this sort of thing, right? It helps to, I think, bring some clarity to that. And the pre-operational linked to, sort of hunter-gatherer societies is an example where when we're thinking about that correlation, actually there's, as I mentioned, there's a number of problems that come up with that. Some of them are just sort of social and how these ideas then land for people when people feel like there's a kind of correlation going on between, indigenous societies and infancy or something like that. I mean, you can understand how that would be incredibly problematic at so many kind of social levels, and theoretically as well. There's some limitations profoundly to trying to make that kind of move. So if you can update the model that you're bringing to it and actually show, well, no, that's actually not the case, I think, one, it will help kind of make these ideas a lot more accessible to people and palatable to them in the academy. It will help be a meaningful corrective to historical uses of these kinds of models in the academy. Part of why we've seen them have trouble in the academy is for some of these problematic correlations. So I think this can help with some of that. But yeah, there's so much that it really does to force us to kind of rethink this in an important way. But I think that if we do, and when we do, there is a kind of alignment. It kind of clicks, and you're like, oh yeah, actually that makes a lot more sense. So that's a kind of first set of thoughts on that issue.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I know that as I've thought about it, one of the things you and I have talked about too is like you got to decide sort of what you hold fixed. And what I find helpful to remember is, well, there was actually a temple and there was actually a civilization in this actual period, in this actual location, and that was actually like sort of a verifiable set of things. Now what we're seeing is what was the level of complexity of the cognitive elites of that era. And so that kind of like, okay, that was the part of the ruler that didn't change, but here is what the elite production looked like. And I found from your book, if anybody hasn't read it, I highly recommend it. It's The Evolution of Meaning, a Universal Learning Process by our dear friend here. And one of the things you say in it, which I love, is the notion that at its most sort of at its most rich and at its most meaningful, no pun intended, information is sacred.
Mm.
And what I always remember as you go through these texts is how sacred they were, because these sacred texts are often what we're creating the kind of unifying holism or the gestalt of the worldview that is then permeating the whole culture and holding it together. So maybe you talk just a little bit about that sacrality and the nature of the information and the text that's coming from the elites inside of those, socio.
Yeah, and I'll start just by nodding to that idea too, that really when you ask the question of what it is that we are studying here, it is essentially the leading edge of thought. And so I think that's an important aspect to throw into the meta-theoretical side of the conversation, because it's not necessarily just as simple to say, well, we found these numbers empirically, therefore we can equate, amber with this or something like that. It's not that simple. We have to do some finessing even of how we understand what these numbers are telling us about the cultural systems from
Well,
which
and one thing I just wanted to put a quick caveat in there. I would remind everybody of that beautiful kind of segmentation, the archaeology segmentation of meaning that comes out of the levels analysis, where even if somebody is scoring at, let's say, 10D, actually a lot of their performances are
Yeah.
all down the thing. And so you really do get this much more variegated notion of how somebody might be living inside of a culture in terms of their their meaning structures, but at the very leading edge, it might have this very little tippity top coming out at like, abstract or concrete or whatever.
Yeah, actually, and that's huge. And I encourage people to kind of, if you watch this again and look at that picture again, because there's so much in that depiction of the distributions of meanings using the lectical scale that way. That was a big kind of aha moment. Because, for example, when you're looking at text and they're scoring in level 9, let's say,
So why
well,
don't we put that up while you're talking? Let's put that slide back up.
I can try. Yeah, why not? Let me just give me 1 second as I try to find that. But as I am doing that, I'll just say that yeah, that when we consider all right, do that and then share my screen. Let me know when you see that.
There it is. Yeah.
There it is. Yeah. So what I was going to say is if you look at, say, level 9, which is the abstract level in the MHC, if you just kind of go kind of superficially and you say, oh, abstract level, that sounds super abstract. But actually, if you look at kind of what you're really scoring there, the amount of kind of literally in the tier of abstractions that shows up in 9A and 9B is very minimal. It's just that little tip of the iceberg.
Right.
And so I think it's important to understand what these levels actually are, all the different layers that are underneath them, this sort of thing, because it gives us a better sense when we think about, oh, well, I read this particular hunter-gatherer's story. It sounded like super particularistic, super concrete. There wasn't a lot of abstraction there at all. It's like, well, yes, that's what this particular level is capturing in it when you see it this way. But it is fascinating too then when you look at and you compare that to, say, the systematic level, and you see kind of how much of that is then includes kind of symbolic information at the level of abstractions, and of course formal is just abstract mappings and so on. So you're really seeing, in a sense, ideas fill up with a level of abstraction over time, and I think that all that's really important. So here, I'll stop sharing again and tackle that
I think
second.
there's something just to say. I mean, like, here we are in 2024, 25 now, sorry. Climate change, like all these things, and people are wondering, like, why can't this species get its act together? And it's like, well, actually, we may be certainly kind of like really late stage at a very small proportion up here, but we've also got this whole stack of meaning that's occurring throughout the whole species, and it's hard to coordinate all of that. And like, we have very fragmented meaning structures. And so I actually think it also introduces not only a bit of humility on behalf of anybody who would use models like this, or some real humility, because you really have to kind of understand the nuance and the complexity of them. But there's also a sense in which, like, there's a lot of worlds going on. There's a lot of variegation, and there's a lot of stratification in the way that people are navigating and making sense of the world. And it kind of puts our challenges I think in modern terms in a new light.
Yeah, I think so. And again, I mean, we could geek out on the theory, and I'm happy to, though it's actually really important for some of the implications as well, because I think that when we have a proper understanding of what these models are, what they're actually telling us, I think we can use them a lot more responsibly. So one of the other things about that is that, like, this isn't like, we're not looking at people here. We're looking at performances, right? We're looking at a distribution of ideas matching particular levels in a given text. And performances shift. They shift by context. And one of the things that's interesting about this CCI project is that, in a sense, what we are trying to get at is what are the complexity profiles for a particular set of ideas, let's say, right? If you're looking at texts that come out of polytheistic societies, let's say from the ancient Near Eastern kingdoms, and there's a kind of thematic similarity to them, but there's also a complexity similarity to these as well. So trying to establish kind of complexity profiles for particular meaning systems, maybe as they're correlated with particular modes of production or other things from, say the lower right, these kinds of things, and then use that as a basis for trying to understand cultural evolution. So I say all that too because I don't want people to misunderstand what a cultural complexity index is doing. It's not saying, oh, this culture is this complexity level, this culture, it's not doing that. It's just looking at cultural complexification in any context, and looking at the level of cognitive complexity manifested in its performances in a regular way across the different meaningful texts that have been produced in those milieus. So I think that that's important. But to jump back, because I do want to hit on the sacred thing, which I think is really important, just to tie that thread. Yeah, I think when we appreciate that information is processed for the viability and the flourishing of entities in context, then we can also appreciate that some things that we've learned, you become really, in a sense, enshrined as successful strategies, successful approaches to issues of ultimate concern. And when that occurs, and you get that kind of, if you want to think about like a path that gets trampled down, over grass, you can kind of see a well-worn path there. Or you can make the same connection to sort of neural connections in our brain, like a well-established memory or idea that has like deep myelination, this sort of thing. The idea is that really well-established notions of meaning get set down, institutionalized, and then people get socialized into that because these are the ideas that societies have deemed of utmost importance for the continued viability of the collective. And I think that that's a really powerful way of understanding what we mean by the sacred, because a category like the sacred, as many religious anthropologists will tell you, will look very, very different in many, many different contexts. It's actually been the reason why a lot of people have said it's not a good term, it's not a good category, because what's the same about a tribal pole and a temple complex, and a holy book and a center of legislation, or these different ideas which people might say, oh, that's sacred, that's sacred. What are the similarities there? Well, content-wise, they're not particularly similar, but if you look at functionally what they're doing, they are upholding the world of a society. It is the world informing meaning of a particular society. And when you can look at those different societies as different structural manifestations, you could say, or different versions of different levels of complexity as they unfold at those different levels across the stack and across those different levels of individual, collective, interior, exterior, then you can get a sense of like, oh yes, we're looking at the evolution of conceptions of the sacred for different kinds of sociological contexts as holding containers for individuals, and you get the understanding that learning of individuals is what's updating those societal notions of the sacred. And then the last thing on that point I want to make, which is something you mentioned at the beginning, which is really crucial, is that this is how we solve steering problems, structural, society level, existential challenges, right? So when we meet the limits of our meaning system, it's no longer able to sustain the system, or the system has complexified and needs a new kind of meaning to stabilize that level of complexity. You have this kind of collective existential meaning crisis, existential crisis, that individuals in that society need to submit the insights from their own individual learning processes to help update the collective infrastructure there. And so I think of the kinds of projects that IAM is engaged in, and that various people in this sort of integrative space and across these different communities of big picture thinking. That is the existential challenge, where we're trying to enter that space and learn our way into the darkness to try to solidify something so we can, in a sense, update our collective meaning structure. And this project helps us get a kind of meta map of what that has looked like in the past.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it is very hard not to read Vervaeke's meaning crisis in this. It's very hard to not read the metacrisis in this, the transformation age and the great release and the breakdown geopolitically. It's a fragmentation of sacrality. It's a fragmentation of any kind of not only just unified symbols, but the way in which those symbols have been institutionalized, because now we don't trust our institutions either. And so we've had a breakdown in all four quadrants at every level, at some level of disintegration. And as Durkheim might point out, like that's what holds the world together. I mean, this is what holds these things together and is so important. important. So I do, again, even though this work is backwards looking, it just feels so relevant for today and what we're going through. As Ken might say, we're looking for mana, new forms of mana to hold each
Yeah.
other together with and have some new worldview emerge, which of course is something we talk a lot about in our tribe here about a new story of wholeness. Like there is definitely something that's attempting to be born this century out of the meta systematic and integral and meta modern and other communities that are saying, wait a minute, it's not just dry, lifeless exteriors that are positivistic and meaningless. You know, there's something far more rich going on and far more sacred, far more animated, and that story and that paradigm needs to be given more seriousness by culture, because it may also be the very thing that redeems us and allows us to reorient to a positive vision of the future and gets us out of this metacrisis.
Yeah, and 2 points on that. One is, even though this project is largely backwards looking, as you say, and it's about assessing previous cultural evolution up to the present to understand that where that kind of stacks up, these tools can be applied to present day and in orientation towards the future. I mean, as we come together around this collective effort to articulate that new story of wholeness, I mean, one thing you could do is, as we find various articulations of it, do we assess it in terms of its hierarchical complexity? Like, does that story land where we think it does in the stack relative to all the rest of our earlier findings? And I'm not saying it's in a crude, simplistic way that, oh, well, if this telling didn't, then it's not the right story. But I'm just saying this gives us another tool in our arsenal to be able to, say, are we going in the right direction? Are we actually moving in the kind of integrative, complexifying direction that evolution sort of calling us to? And so this is kind of one additional element to bring to that question. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, which is a big part of this project, it's really part of the whole thesis of, change, theory of change and transformation element to this is, we do need, while we're building that new story and that new system, we also need to try to salvage existing institutions and infuse those existing institutions with the seeds that are going to grow into that new system and that new story. And so you can't do that if the institutions that exist don't take even the seeds of your story seriously. And so a big reason why I believe historically some of these meta theories of psychocultural evolution have been persona non grata in the academy is because, well, people can say, well, that's just subjective. You're talking about development and this sort of thing, but there's no rigor there. It's just sociological speculation, and it might be a nice story, but it's also problematic for some of the reasons we talked about earlier, and et cetera. So we can actually have some data to actually say, well, wait a second. We've tested these hypotheses. We found some validation for them. This needs to be taken seriously. At the very least, you're now in a conversation, in like an academic conversation, where people can challenge your ideas, can, reproduce your experiments, can engage in actual social science to try to, stress test the validity of these ideas. And so that's really important going forward for if we're trying to change the institutions that be and move them in the right direction. We need work like this to be able to present these ideas as well as internally for ourselves, because we need to stress test our own ideas for ourselves. It's not just about the institutions; it's about having the best models we can.
Yeah, and holding ourselves honest in a humble way, but also a scientifically rigorous way. I'm reminded of the conversation I think we got in on Slack the other day with a few of us when I mentioned Bruce Alderman's mentioning of integral differential pluralism as a religious sort of ethic, and the notion that, and again, this is more for those who might be tuning into this video who may not be as familiar, but the whole point of complexity is that transcends but includes, like it actually integrates what came before it so that it sort of creates a bigger umbrella for everyone to fit in. And so the notion of a 21st century story of wholeness is that it will genuinely be whole, because by being complex enough, it reintegrates the pluralism that the world is naturally going through.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes maximally differentiated, and it's fighting because it's still kind of all in this, under-integrated flat spot. But by something re-emerging, or qualitatively emerging, that's got a higher level of complex organization, now all of a sudden everybody has a place that they can fit, and no one feels oppressed by the other person's point of view or practice or what have you. And so that's why this stuff is so critical, that we see more complex, more conscious, more integrative modes of sort of social organization emerge, and you're really providing the science behind that, which I love.
Thank
All
you.
right, with that, we have, I'll bring in Josh. He had his hand raised.
Yeah, so thanks, Brendan. It's so great to see this starting to shape up. And of course, it's like, in some ways you could see this is like a life's work worth of projects that spin off of this, because there's so many really interesting things you can do with this data, even once we get to the point where we have a kind of fairly fully fleshed out timeline. I think the two pieces that I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit about, one for everyone else's sort of understanding, because we've talked about it, and the other just because I'm curious about it. So the first one is I'd love to hear you chat a little bit about how at some point you want to start to correlate some of the sort of sociological complexification models that are out there that exist in academia, correlate that with cultural complexification and cognitive complexification. And I think what I'm particularly interested about in that is seeing, Rob is doing some work on the sort of sociology of big pictures or sociology of ideas, how ideas evolve. I can't wait to see, if there are correlations between different cultures clashing or crossing. What are the sort of external stimulants that end up creating the shifts in the evolution of culture and consciousness? So that's one thing I'm particularly interested in. Love to hear you chat a little bit about. And then the second is just, I think the other thing that, in some ways, what I'm hoping that this work can do, especially since you're focused on the evolution of ultimate concern and of meaning, is to show how even some of these religious and spiritual institutions themselves have evolved over time. Or like once you start to get, for example, Christianity in the axial age, I think it's really helpful in terms of sort of like recognizing that all religions don't just sit at this particular traditional sort of relative lack of complexity to modern or postmodern thinking, but to show that the religious institutions themselves and the complexity of religious thought has advanced within a particular religious lineage, because I think it potentially holds open the idea that these religious models or these religious structures don't have to be completely abandoned, that they can be updated as our thinking, as our cultures themselves update. So I'm curious if that's something that you're going to be explicitly trying to do.
Yeah, great questions. Lots there. I mean, on the first part about correlations with social complexification, kind of the lower right stuff, there's a database, I believe it's called the Shishet database. I think this is stuff that Peter Turchin, uses for his work and his kind of cohort and a number of scholars. It's open access, so anyone can use it. What they've done is basically compile a whole number of variables and variable data relative to this question of like cultural, you could call it cultural complexity. So for example, like presence of architecture or sorry, not architecture, agriculture, yes, no. Presence of alphabet or literacy, yes, no. There's a certain kind of, I don't know how many variables there are. There's probably over 100. They get into divisions of labor and various kinds of things like of that nature. And so anyway, that database already exists, and you've got hundreds of scholars kind of participating in curating that from across different areas of study. So that, Egyptologists and classicists and these sorts of folks kind of being very specific about and per each culture, did ancient Egypt in, this particular century, or it might even go by decade, I'm not sure, have this or not. And anyway, so what that allows is, this picture of some of the most basic suggestions of the social complexity, some of the cues or signals of meaningful signals that could be used to try to establish those kinds of metrics. And so what I would like to do is look for correlations between what we're finding in the kind of cognitive complexity, semantic complexity, and these social complexities that we're able to map in other ways. So that would essentially be, well, depending how you necessarily want to think about this, something like an actual, again, empirical correlation between lower left and lower right aspects, to see do those exist. So that is, yes, that's down the line. We'd need to fill up our whole database first, and then we'd have to have, some more help with that kind of a project. But I think it's very feasible. And it's exciting because then we could begin to start filling out this picture even more. And again, just get a really robust, empirically grounded validation of this sort of integrative model. So that's on the horizon. But as you also said, this is a lifelong project, and I kind of consider this more or less my lifelong project as far as I'm concerned, at least academically and conceptually, and it's sort of my passion. There's so much that comes out of all of this. I could, if people are interested, I could also talk a little bit about some of the side projects that we can also tie in with some of these things. I just got some Fowler data I'm going to be scoring for hierarchical complexity. Can we look at structural parallels between, historiogenic genetic material and the Fowler phase stages? And so that's exciting. So anyway, long-term project, and the correlations between social and cultural complexity is on the list. The second thing, which now that I've settled on, it's escaped from my mind, had to do with, just remind me real quick.
Just tracking the evolution of religious traditions themselves.
Right. So this is important. And again, sorry to those for whom this might be like super in the weeds and boring, but also, this is for the geeks who like really, appreciate really getting nuanced about these kinds of things. So one of the things that's really interesting is like, again, thinking about what is it that we're actually finding. It's not, as you say, like just pegging, oh, well, this level and this religion are here, or even this, this way of doing religion necessarily shows up just here, because one of the things that you have to think about is sort of like thresholds, like what's the minimum threshold for an idea to show up in the world originally, right? Now, once an idea has shown up in the world, it can be downward assimilated. So that's an interesting thing that you've got to be able to consider. For example, let's say that we are looking historiogenetically at, some of the biblical material, and then we can score that, and we can see where that shows up. Then we actually have empirical basis for saying, all right, well, this idea of God here, in a sense, you could say to some degree, is showing up at this level. Now, in the present time, if a child is learning about, let's say, the Christian tradition or the Jewish tradition, and they're reading the Bible, they might encounter that material, but they're going to be coming at it from a lower cognitive developmental level. So they're going to be downward assimilating it. So an idea that required a certain threshold to show up, once it exists, can now be engaged from a lower level. Similarly, once an idea shows up, it can also be updated, right? And taken into higher levels of abstraction. So if you look at like Thomas Aquinas, when we go to, score text from him, I'm sure those are going to score incredibly high. They're going to be at levels that we would probably say, oh, these are like modern levels or something, right? But it's using the code of an axial age tradition. But he's talking about God as, the ground, or the being itself, and this sort of thing, right? So again, once you get sort of a tradition going, it can itself complexify. And so then we need to, again, draw the distinction. So what we're actually looking for when we're looking at modern levels is like, what is the minimum threshold for an idea like, I don't know, heliocentrism, or something that becomes paradigmatic in the modern framework, the notion of evolution, this sort of thing. So these get really, you're mixing a lot of different aspects in here, and to do it responsibly from a meta-theoretical level, there's a lot of, as those who know the Big Lebowski would say, there's a lot of strands to keep in the old duder's head here. But so there's a lot of things that go into trying to parse this out, appropriately, and those have to be in the mix. But at the very least, what we're trying to do is establish historically, where do these things show up, and can we make a meaningful assessment? And then we can start to build out from there, like, more contemporaneously. If we see these ideas, they can show up at different levels, but that's because they already exist, this sort of thing.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. We had a couple of questions related to how were the texts chosen?
Yeah, so a little bit different in each case. So with the forager corpus, Obviously, you're not dealing with original texts because you're talking about oral societies. So how do you score the text of an oral society? In this case, what was really important is finding texts that were transcribed from an oral performance, but as literally as possible. And this has been actually part of a challenge methodologically in this study. It's not just as simple as, oh, we'll go find some anthology of tales and we'll just score them, because who's the translator, And if they're a Victorian Englishman and they're writing things that, they're imposing a kind of translational language on the text that isn't actually in the original, you could say, then you're actually scoring the hierarchical complexity performance of a Victorian Englishman, and you're not actually getting at the real thing there. So part of the methodology considered, usually a good anthropological method will say at the outset, like, I transcribe these as literally as possible, or they'll just say I made embellishments or I updated this and that. And so if I found that someone said that it was loose translation or something, I would say, okay, we can't use this. So yeah, I was working with it's called the Forager bibliography. It's 4 various kinds of meta-analyses of hunter-gatherer societies as the basis of selecting texts. And then I had to winnow the ones and find the right ones. So anyway, I could talk more about that. But the point was, that's an important thing. We're trying to get at the performance that's reflective of the conceptual abstraction levels of the person giving the performance. In these ancient texts, we then are always having that mediation challenge through translation. And so Theo has been amazing in the dedication that she has put to this project, because it's not just as simple as running these through the computer and getting a score, which I'd kind of hoped at the outset it could be. That will happen later on as we get more into contemporary texts, and these translation issues aren't a thing so much. But for these early texts, she's got to go in there and she's got to parse out, is this and there are graphs and things that she can use to actually see statistically, like, is this an outlier? Is this term likely to come from this learning level or not? So that's why some of this has gone a little bit slower for these early stages, but the translation aspect is there. So there's all that. The other aspect is we're looking at meaningful texts. I'm looking at what you could say is, if you're trying to use something like these altitude levels to consider a taxonomy of meaning systems, and you're talking about animistic, meanings, archaic and axial meanings. Again, I mentioned talking about Robert Bella's book. He's got an excellent treatment of sort of like thematically and content-wise what kind of show up at these different different levels of religious thought. So that's where we're starting. Essentially, it's just there. It's just trying to find texts that match mode of production. Is it an agricultural state, or is it a hunter-gatherer society? Is it a complex hunter-gatherer society? Is it sedimentary? Is it nomadic, etc.? Some of these anthropological considerations go into this. And then, we also aren't just looking at when they discovered most of the tablets from the ancient Mesopotamian societies, most of them were just receipts. We're not looking at receipts. We're looking at the Epic of Gilgamesh. We're looking at the Baal cycle, because we're interested in what do people make of what the world is about, and life and death and meaning and God and I don't know, the abyss, these sorts of things. So content-wise, we're filtering that through the lens of all that. And then the other thing I'll say about that is we're also looking for paradigmatically significant texts. What I mean is, if those who are familiar with, say, Thomas Kuhn's notion of a paradigm, you're talking about texts that have been anthologized, that have been textbookified, that serve as a template, or are used in intergenerational transmission of meaning, right? Like, that is actually something that's not arbitrary. During the so-called canon wars, of the postmodern era, it's still the case that you could empirically look at, well, who are the postmodern authors who have been the most anthologized, right? And so some of that comes into play. So in the axial age, we actually have canons. The Bible is a canon. In even earlier archaic periods, the Epic of Gilgamesh was copied for centuries by scribes as a training process. You could say it's a kind of paradigm. And so there's a methodological aspect to that, of we're not just looking at, oh, well, this text was, no one thought about it, but it was discovered and, recently, and so now we're going to score it. We're actually looking at what were probably culturally specific or significant texts or materials for this particular meaning system. And yeah, so those were other aspects that we considered.
Wonderful.
My question is really basic in many ways, Brendan, because I think I'm still trying to understand what you're doing. What are you trying to measure? So I'll be the stupid one to kind of have you explain that a little bit again. Am I right in a really basic sense? Am I right to gather or gauge that what you're doing is you're trying to understand social complexification and the evolution of it. And to do that, you're looking at texts from various different cultures or various different epochs or eras or whatever. And that's going to determine the various different granularities of social complexification through history. Am I getting that in a basic sense right, or
Something like that. Yeah, I mean, how I would say it is, again, just to use the integral model, like if you compare the upper left and the lower left, you're looking at a correlation between concrete operations, formal operations, the Piagetian, system, and then down in the lower left, you've got cultural worldviews that are analogously structured, right? And so then you get mythic systems and rational systems, this sort of thing. So there's been historically a correlation between cognitive complexity and cultural complexity, we'll call it. It's something like the intersubjective meaning sphere that we swim in. So that has been the claim, and those familiar with integral theory should be that won't be controversial at all. That's kind of one of the core ideas. So what I'm doing is just basically saying, okay, let's test that. The thing is, with kind of the old Piagetian models, one, they're a bit outdated, and we have these new things, model of hierarchical complexity and the Lectical Scale that uses that. And two, though, you can't apply really a Piagetian style experiment to a culture, right? Like if you look at the experiments that Piaget used, it was like, the three mountain problem, and I'll put water from one beaker into another, and I'll see if the child can see, And so these were kinds of like various kinds of psychometric studies that Piaget would do to try to situate the learning of someone and how that unfolds. So obviously you can't do that to try to assess cultural worldviews, but what you can do now that we have the model of hierarchical complexity and specifically the Lectical Scale that can use texts to establish what is the hierarchical complexity of this particular text. What are the ideas that are showing up in this text? Where do those land? And we can, again, that's a neo-Piagetian framework. Then we can actually begin to show correlations if they exist and what they are using that. So that would be kind of how I would say it. Yeah.
Okay, I think I get that. So if that's what's happening, let's say, for example, so I'm looking at my own culture. I come from Sri Lanka, and this is a really ancient culture. We have, the Buddha's oral teachings were written down in Sri Lanka, according to history, about 500 years after the death of the Buddha. So some of it is written in like Pali language and all that. But so there are really complex texts from the history of Sri Lanka. What does that then in your model say about culture in Sri Lanka, for example?
Well, it really would depend, on what one finds in those texts and what the significance is. I'll give you an example, though. I mean, I don't want to suggest that very ancient complexity isn't possible. Some data that I've got in, there's a fascinating text that comes from ancient Egypt from around like 2500 BCE, and it's called The Wisdom of Pahotep. And when you read it, it sounds like Ecclesiastes. It sounds like, maybe it's like wisdom literature that you might find in the Bible or something, right? Very much later. I had that scored. That actually scores around 1080. So like very late formal level. And you're talking about 2500 BCE. So one, we have to be careful that it's not just this notion of like somehow time makes things more complex. That's not the idea. The idea is that if there is resources, energy, and social complexity in the system, and that allows for things like education systems to develop and various kinds of training, scribal literacy, things that change the cognitive complexity of a mind. Those are sort of the necessary prerequisites to see the consequent forms of cognitive complexity that would stem from that. So it's not just time; it's about what is the cultural milieu and that sort of thing. So I'm not familiar enough with the Sri Lankan materials, and I'm not sure what that would find. And if you have some examples that you would want to suggest that we score and include in our analysis, we could actually do this sort of thing. And this is also, in some ways, a kind of open invitation, solicitation from the broader community for ideas on this project. But yeah, so I think it's a matter of analysis. One thing there's so many things that have to be sifted through for this kind of study. One of them is, when we read a text, are we reading the complexity of a translator that's overlaid on some, original text? When we read a text, are we reading into that text a lot of the subsequent tradition that has emerged since, right? So, for example, we can score, the Binding of Isaac story, and we did in this so far, and that text just on the page will land somewhere. In this case, it was upper 900s, I think. So that's where that text lands, but that isn't to necessarily say that text doesn't subsequently come to have a considerable amount of complexity added to it through interpretation, through layers and glosses of centuries of tradition. So many things that can come out of that, some of which could even have been nascently in there originally, some of which we're reading later on. So there's so many aspects of interpretation and hermeneutics and sort of certain sociological considerations that need to be taken into account for something like this. And yeah, when all that's kind of appropriately considered, we're just trying to find data that we ourselves need to interpret, right? Which is, this is data, but it's not necessarily, no data is, just sort of on its face apparent, like what the significance of it is. We need to interpret it. And so the example I tend to give is, though we haven't done this yet, I suspect if you were to score Hemingway's, The Old Man and the Sea, you probably would get a rather low score because the language in that text is so simple. The man, he went into his boat, the dog came, this sort of thing, right? But of course, if you read into that text and you read it as part of what Hemingway's kind of project was as a writer and the whole gestalt of the whole thing and the aesthetics of it, its complexity isn't entirely summed up in its hierarchical complexity score, right? And hopefully as integrative thinkers we can just take that datum for what it is, but also appreciate the broader context that it helps us to illuminate in various other ways.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if that gets at your question, but
I have so many more questions around like what we call social hold-ons, not having stages in general. And there's just a lot of, and also the idea that yes, in integral theory and a lot of other stage models, developmental models, we might have a certain general idea of cultures being in a certain stage. But Wilbur, for example, has always claimed that no matter what, that's just an orienting generalization for a mimetic field, a mimetic structure. That does not mean that there aren't any saints and stages and sciences that peak at different stages throughout history. So I'll leave it at that, but I have so many questions, but thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, and happy to talk to folks in other contexts too about this project. Real quick, I will just say, I totally agree. I wouldn't use any of this data to try to say this culture is at this stage or anything like that. One, again, clarification is this is a project that I think is really trying to get at the question of societal learning processes. And if we can identify any moments in cultural evolution when new ideas came on the scene, in a sense, for the first time, it's a historiogenetic analysis of there either were ideas like this before or there weren't. When they show up, do they show up at higher levels of complexity? And I think generally speaking, that is the case, but it's a different hypothesis than saying a culture is at a stage or anything like that. But yeah.
Yeah, Brendan, thank you. My question kind of piggybacks off of Nomali, and I think you actually sort of addressed some of this. I've just got sort of a collection of notes that I'm going to read because I organize my thoughts better through writing than sort of ad hoc in conversation. So, to me, a lot of this confusion, I find myself confused anyway, when it comes to these multiple definitions of culture that we seem to be holding. On the one hand, you presented Gregg Henriques' slide, I think it was, where culture is sort of representing what Ken Wilber would call the noosphere, right? We go from physiosphere to biosphere to noosphere, which is the sort of the world of symbols and meaning and so forth. As an integralist, we probably get a little bit triggered by that, and maybe you can help kind of disarm our triggers, because for us, we're accustomed to thinking of culture as the lower left quadrant, the interior of the collective. So when it comes to something like cultural complexity, it's not always necessarily clear which you're looking at. Are you looking at just sort of the entire symbolic matrix that we're all living in, both as individuals and as collectives? Or are we looking at particularly groups of people and how they sort of self-organize and how they construct meaning and share meaning and so forth? And just as sort of a note, I'm also, I think there's limitations to how culture as shorthand for the lower left quadrant. But when we think of culture, we can also think of a set of customs and shared practices that we do, which are all technically more lower right quadrant than it is lower left. But either way, I think culture is representing sort of the lower quadrants. And I think this is an important distinction, because if we're doing, you're doing basically a lectical analysis of a series of particular artifacts. And the most we can say by doing this kind of methodology is that the individual who created this artifact is coming from a particular stage of cognitive development.
Mm-hmm.
We might also be able to get a general sense of some of the overall cultural kind of flavors and contexts that the artifact was created within, but really we're focusing on the cognitive development of the individual, which doesn't tell us much at all really about sort of how that artifact is being enacted or being socialized by the actual culture that it appeared in, or any of the sort of cultures that have organized around those ideas ever since. The idea, one of the things that we talked about with integral is the principle of non-exclusion, that everyone is right so long as everyone kind of stays in their lane, right? We don't want to take a methodology that is created to disclose a particular kind of reality and kind of overextend that into other realities. So right here, I think what you're doing is you're using an upper left methodology, this lectical sort of analysis. And I'm curious how much that can actually tell us about culture itself as the lower left and maybe a little bit the lower right, because it seems to me that would require other methodologies. Ken has this whole, his methodological pluralism. It includes things like heuristics and hermeneutics and social anthropology and so forth, which are actually methodologies that are created to look particularly at things like cultural complexity. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit, because I do feel like some of the presentation maybe slides between these different conceptions of what culture means, both as, again, the interior of a group of people, or just as the entire kind of symbolic matrix itself. It's important because, dogs have culture, bees have culture, right? It's not something that's exclusive to the human animal if we're defining it by the lower left quadrant.
Yeah, so both of those things. Okay, so the first one, yes, to be very clear, I'm not talking about the culture that goes all the way down, that's at all quadrant levels that you're describing. I'm not talking about that. I am just talking about the noosphere. I'm talking about humans using symbolic information processing to do the uniquely human thing, which is to create culture. So I think basically the whole thing on number one is just semantics, that we have words and we use them in different ways in different contexts. I'm also open to suggestions for the language that we do use for this. I'm on the fence around, do we call this a cultural complexity index or not? Could there be a better way of languaging this so that people for various reasons don't get their hackles up and they actually understand what it is specifically that we're looking at? So there could be ways that we could be more clear about that. But for clarity's sake, yes, just talking about culture in the noosphere sense, and not in that other sense. As for the other issue around, quadrant totalitarianism, using, different methodologies out of place, that sort of thing. I think one of the things that you stated was really important to consider, which is that, yes, what we are measuring is a performance and its hierarchical complexity. Now, so we're not just saying, oh, okay, now we can extrapolate on, whatever. We're saying this is a datum. It gives us some information, and that is meaningful. That's meaningful information for this project. And we don't want to overextend that. We don't want to get out ahead of ourselves to try to, make too much of that. I would say we can make a little bit more of it than what you're suggesting, because what we can do is, for example, if you have a hunter-gatherer society, and you never find in any of the data that you collect, let's say any score above 1,000, that's a meaningful insight, right? Especially if the more data that you have, then you can start to say, there might be a tie between a social organizational structure and certain levels of cognitive complexity. I mean, one of my working hypotheses is that literacy itself is huge for this. And this isn't a new idea. Vygotsky and Hallpike and other people have talked about this, that when we learn to read, it actually changes our brain and changes the way we think. And that actually makes our minds more reflective and more abstract. So my hypothesis there then is that, okay, well, you can actually test that, right? So if we were to find, meta-systematic thought in a hunter-gatherer society, that hypothesis is blown out of the water, and literacy is not important for cognitive complexity, and you can make a number of other conclusions from that. So in some senses, it's a kind of evidence from absence, and you don't want to make too much of that. But in some ways, those that missing evidence is itself evidence of something. You can at least say, we do not find evidence of this here. And when you can do that for different levels, I think that can be instructive. So that's one thing I would say around that. And then another thing I would say is really, again, that if you have enough data of the individual level cognitive complexity, then in a sense, you're always getting closer and closer to the collective, right? We'll never be able to go back in time, or even, let's just say, we'll never be able to get a lectical analysis of everyone who lived in ancient Rome. Not going to happen. We can do that for Virgil. We can do that for, Tiberius. We can do that for, and say, okay. And then you can do it. And the more you do it, well, you're no longer just in the individual anymore. You're starting to get a picture, a profile of at least what all these people share in common, sociologically speaking. And then if there's a profile for that we can identify at that level, I think we can meaningfully extrapolate that to make other kinds of claims about culture and society and those sorts of things. So yes, it's important to always qualify what we're actually getting at. And again, to Rob's point, sometimes we got to go back to basics, like what exists? What are we actually looking at here? And so that's really important. I just think that what we're trying to do is generate data that can actually be used to clarify some of these things that we're talking about, right? Like, I think that a lot of us have the experience of when we read a meta-theoretical thinker, Wilbur or Henriques or whoever, there might be a kind of intuitive, aha, yes, I see it all, there it all is. But then, we've got to actually subject that to critical scrutiny and say, well, wait a second, but wait. And then, many conversations will then ensue around being like, well, wait, but this doesn't work and this doesn't fit. And I think rather than just saying, well, it's an orienting generalization, we should also say, well, maybe there's a way of getting more precise with what it is that we're actually saying so that we're not, conflating things and speaking across each other. So I think these kinds of projects are important for that. They just help us clarify, they help us get more rigorous. And as far as I'm concerned, the more data, the better. And this is one methodology, but certainly it's not the only one. It tells us something, but it hardly tells us everything. So I think if we just have more of this data, that's a good thing, but it shouldn't be at the exclusion of other kinds of analyses at all.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And just as a real brief follow-up, I mean, I think one of the reasons why this conversation is so important, if anything, is that it helps break us out of sort of the developmental stereotypes and caricatures that we might project onto prior cultures. We might have this idea that in a quote unquote amber culture, and by culture here, I mean lower left quadrant, this group of people 2,000 years ago, everyone in that culture was amber or below, right? Amber was sort of the developmental ceiling for that group of people. And I think that my hypothesis is that your data is going to break those caricatures, because as it turns out, human beings as individuals have the full spectrum of human potential available to them at every era in history. The likelihood of actually reaching into those higher structures is lower the farther back you go, however, because you have less of a culture in that lower left quadrant, the substrate to support that. And even when they do, even if someone is in, let's say, 10,000 years ago, a largely magenta to red culture, and you have a genuine orange thinker, let's say, they're still operating, their orange cognition is still operating upon the magenta and red symbols that are available to them within that culture. So in a sense, their higher stage cognition is getting down coded into the language of the era within which they live. And it can get really, really difficult to kind of tease those apart, right? Like what aspects of this communication are coming from the individual's complexity of cognitive development, and where are sort of the limits of the language showing up, right? But we know, for example, that Pythagoras was doing formal operational thinking 2,000 years before anything like modernity emerged. We know that Jesus Christ was likely, in my reading anyway, far more developed than most of the individuals in the cultures that self-organized around his teachings over the following 2,000 years. So it's this really, really interesting question about how do these cognitive ideas emerge out of the individual and then get socialized? And how much of that socialization process remains a vertical process of like, here's an orange stage stacked on top of an amber stage, stacked on top of, and so forth. And how much of it is more like a horizontalization where, for example, today we are all living in a postmodern culture, regardless of our own interior stages of development. I consider Donald Trump to be the first postmodern president, for example, despite none of his lines coming anywhere near the green level development. So we're all able to participate in these various kinds of stage-related cultures once they become more of a horizontal culture rather than singularly a vertical culture.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about all that, and I think you're making a lot of great points,
Totally.
and trying to disaggregate. I think one of the challenges for some of these models is the fact that we're forced to use language like, well, it's green, it's orange cognition using red symbols. You know what I mean? Like because inherently, then we've already mixed up what in some ways we're trying to separate. So if we can actually be a little bit more specific and say, well, actually, so here's cognitive complexity and here's a symbol set and how do they relate? That's kind of what this is in some ways trying to help tease apart. And then the other thing about that, something you said is like, you were saying, well, we know that Pythagoras did this, we know Jesus did this. And actually, I would say we don't yet know that in the sense that we don't have empirical data. I'm not saying that I would disagree with those characterizations that you gave, but I'm just saying that this is the project that will actually be able to let us say, we know that at least the language that's given, for example, in the Gospels that we're analyzing here as a performance scores at this level. So then we can say that. Whereas in the past, I think we've tended to assume things that I think this project may challenge, it may validate, but we just don't know yet. And I would say that's one of the benefits of trying to actually just do this work.
Yeah, and the data might be a little more self-evident when it comes to a Pythagoras because he's doing mathematics, and we know that mathematics require certain kinds of cognitive development and so forth. But yeah, no, point taken. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for your
things
time.
I love about the project. It's going to allow us to develop different social practice around the language we use to describe a lot of this territory, which I think is neat. Thank you, Corey, and hello, Corey.
Yeah, so I suppose I have a comment, and then I have some supporting arguments that then move into a question. And so my comment is in regards to what the other Corey was talking about. And it's kind of a thing, like in big picture frameworks in general, there's a lot of agreement on like universal classes like matter, life, and mind. Like generally everybody agrees on that. And then when it comes to culture, then there's some differences in how people like to organize that into their systems. I think insofar as you have an awareness of it, and I know you do, then I think that can sort of like be, maintained in the sense making, and then, allows for some communicability and translation into different systems. Because obviously the work you're doing is valid. It's just a matter of, what system that we're using to make the interpretation. And then also what Corey was talking about, in hierarchical complexity, there's a notion of like downward assimilation. So you take like a higher order, more complex thought or idea, and then it gets reinterpreted through a less complex behavioral form. And I think that there can also be like upward assimilation as well. Like people can sort of like take something that's lower and then maybe not necessarily translate it the right way, maybe kind of skip stages or something like that. But to get to my supporting arguments here, what I wanted to do is, first of all, I wanted to start with the separating out the container from content, because in domain general stage theories, we're talking about the behavioral form itself, like what the behavioral process is doing, and then separating that out from what the content is, right? So like a really easy way to put this into context would be to say, you don't need to know how to splice a gene to ride a bicycle, right? Like you use one particular level of behavioral complexity to perform a specific kind of task. You don't need to have higher levels in order to do it. And so the reason I'm saying this is because when we're talking about looking at historical texts, historical religious texts, we can make statements about the increase in complexification over time without necessarily having to say anything about the validity of the content of what people are saying.
Mhm.
So that, we can translate this into saying, well, there can be ancient religious wisdoms that had a lower resolution, and we can still carry those forward as we become more knowledgeable and we can think in more behaviorally complex ways. We don't have to get rid of them. We just maybe reinterpret them. We integrate more things that we understand to have a higher degree of resolution. So maybe it was like, 480, 2000 years ago, and now we have like 4K. And then
One of the things you're getting into there that I want to just highlight is the growth to goodness fallacy. The sense that that as things get more complex, they're inherently gooder, to use a terrible word. And I think that's what you got to be really careful of to understand the difference between structure and content. So yes, I mean, fundamentally, no one should hear what we're saying as submitting the growth to goodness fallacy. This is truly a measure of the increasing complexification of the size and complexity of the containers of abstraction that are occurring linguistically and symbolically intermediated, and then whatever kind of associations that can go along with the educational and social structures that historically or anthropologically have already been determined.
Yeah, I'm making a hierarchical statement about stages, that we can think about them both as being horizontal and flat and hierarchical at the same time. Like the behavioral forms themselves have their own functional usefulness for doing specific kinds of things. And it's also true that we can grow through them and become more complex in our behaviors. And so I'll try not to monologue too long here so I can get to the question. I wanted to make a statement here about the fact that the way that we understand our own development individually across domains, domain generally, as societies and all the building blocks of them, the way that we understand it is through it itself. So when earlier on you were showing Wilbur's fulcrums, you're showing the stages, and then you were saying, well, we can actually make some updates. Yes, I mean, I think that's a natural outcome of doing these kinds of inquiries. As we continue to integrate everything together, everything's going to get updated. We're going to get more accurate. It's not, I don't interpret it this way, and I hope other people don't interpret it this way. It's like it's not an attack on the framework. It's actually you're providing support for what Wilbur was doing. Like you're showing that actually he was totally on the right track with what he was describing, and we can keep going with it. So the reason I'm saying this is because what's happening here is you're basically creating this differentiation of units of behavior in a person instead of sort of like, and I'm not saying Wilbur did this because I've heard him talk before and he has understanding about it. And I know many of us here also do, but there's this differentiation and organization of the different units of behavior that compose a person. Like nobody is one thing, like nobody is one stage. And then when we do this differentiation and organize it, we see that actually there, people are all over the map. And then this leads to this notion of the enumeration of population, right? Like in integrative levels, like talking about Michael Kleinberg's work, and then going back to Feibelman, there's this notion that like when you get to the top, there's going to be a smaller number than there of elements than there is below. And that's just a natural consequence of combinatorics. Like if you're at the high stages of behavioral complexity, there's going to be less coordination. And then it's gonna downward coordinate everything that's underneath it, which leads to the upward and downward assimilations.
Well, it's the simple in the simplexity. I mean, it doesn't work if it doesn't in some way reorganize to a higher but more informationally efficient purposiveness inside of that qualitative reorganization. Otherwise, none of this shit works from a point of view of hierarchical reorganization.
Yes. In the same way, like with processes, is the same way with like architectures of building blocks of things. Like there's going to be, less people than there are cells in people's bodies, right?
Greater span, less depth.
Yeah. So this leads to my question then. Because, when we're talking about making these differentiations and realizing that people are at different stages in different parts of themselves, and society's full of people that are developing all over the place, I relate it to your notion of like the universal learning process. And so my question is about that. It's about, sort of taking other work you're doing that's related. How would you apply that to this kind of work? With this, complexity index, if we know, and this goes to what you're talking about earlier, Rob, if we know that people are still going through these stages now, and we have empirical evidence for what's going on and how people behave, and we can carry in this universal learning process, how can we apply that? I mean, I know I'm sort of asking you to sort of create hypotheses or predictions about what it might look like, but I'm very curious about it. And I know you and I have meant to have a conversation about this stuff, but I would like to open it up here. What does the future look like for that sort of a thing?
And so just to clarify, your question is about how does this get applied, or how does this relate to the rest of the universal learning process framework? Just clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, all of it together.
Well, I mean, there's many aspects to this. One is, yes, this is deeply a part of the rest of that project, that universal learning project. This is, I structure that. I do use the UTalk framework of matter, life, mind, and culture. And then you can see those as different kinds of information processing, as I talked about. And then you can see those as different kinds of learning. So genetic learning, or starting with matter, structural learning, genetic learning, cognitive learning, symbolic learning. And this is really, you can start to chunk what cosmic evolution has been doing as you get these new emergent planes of complexity. So the CCI is just focusing on cultural symbolic learning and trying to turn that into a more rigorous kind of science, I guess you could say. This is just the beginning too, so I'll always add that asterisk. So this does go deep down, but what the continuity there and all that is meaning, and it's meaningful information. It's about enhancing viability. And this brings us back to, in terms of applications like the metacrisis, it brings us back to basically the question of what do we do in our current moment to try to update our collective justification system to increase our viability as a whole, as a social whole, as a collective human whole, right? And because it is at the human level now, that level that we've reached into the global sense of concern here that we need to be thinking about. And so that is the question. So when I look around the institutions, I look around our institutions of learning in the academy, I see a deficit in terms of being able to think these thoughts and to be able to contextualize human life properly in a meaningful context. And even to be able to get a sense of what meaning is. So we need to update what is being generationally transmitted as part of our enculturation process. That means we need a new story of wholeness, and I think this helps us tell that story. So there's a a updating of the enculturation process itself underway, and I see this work as being part and parcel of that. It allows us to then plug in what's going on in culture or in the noosphere, let's say, to the biosphere and the physiosphere and see a deep continuity there so that we can identify as being participants in that process, that we can actually see that, oh, wow, what human meanings are doing is of a sort with, you know, what salamanders are doing and what even just rocks and dust in space are doing. Like that to me is a story of wholeness, and this helps zoom in and really in great clarity help us actually map that process at the human level. So all of that's needed in terms of application to confront the systemic challenges that we face, to update our systems of knowledge, and at the individual level. I mean, you can look at this across the quadrants and just say like all the quadrants need some, I think, deeper insight into this process. This is my small part to do what I can to try to just give some data to that and flesh it out and you know, yeah. So that's all. I think that's part of the how this relates and how it's to be applied. I mean, it does need to be applied carefully. There's a lot of nuance that needs to go into, you know, what we make of this data. I think these conversations we've been having here in this Q&A have been great because these are the sorts of questions we need to be asking. These are the clarifications that we need to make. And so I really invite this. I think this is really what we need, because if we spend too much time in the orienting generalization space, sometimes we allow slippages that can be unhelpful and actually then, you know, deleterious to our viability in the long run sense of that. So I think the clearer we can get on this and what's going on, all that helps. So there's, yeah, more things I could say about that, but just as a quick suggestion, that would be.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Corey. All right, well, the no other hands are up, and so that's a perfect place to drop the mic, end on a big, perhaps possibly optimistic point of view about why the work is not just valuable in its own right, but to some degree why it's so important that we reanimate the viability of verticality, because verticality is what gets us back, in some ways, returns us, return of the oppressed, return of the repressed, I guess, from Freud, back to viability itself. And so with that, I think we will come to a close. Thank you all for participating. And thank you, Brendan, for all of your work, your love you put into this. The project is very cool. We're very proud to sponsor and be associated with it. And we'll continue to update everybody as we bring in the other the core pie. And it'll be interesting to see how those next 3, 4, 5 levels play out as we do this over the next 12 months.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Rob. I really appreciate, again, IAM and being and all the support that's come from that. This is, again, a really important thing for me personally, and I hope of value to the community. So thank you so much. Deeply appreciated.
Thanks, Brendan. Appreciate it, man.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Take care.